He went off with a young model, thinking he'd put the past behind him. But years later, he saw 4 children who looked strikingly like him. The city never slept, and neither did David. From the high-rise windows of his penthouse, he could see the restless lights of Manhattan stretching endlessly into the horizon. His world had expanded far beyond what he once imagined, an empire built from sleepless nights, relentless ambition, and a hunger that had pushed him further than most dared to dream. At 36, he had achieved everything society measured as success. His name was printed across headlines, his company, Fast Tech, was a behemoth in the industry, and his wealth was measured in billions. The life he led now was one of opulence. Tailored suits, private jets, and dinners at exclusive clubs where the world's elite exchanged more than pleasantries. It was a world where power meant more than loyalty, where people either advanced or became irrelevant. Yet, somewhere along the way, something had been lost. Venus had been there from the very beginning. She had seen him before the world did, back when he was just another ambitious kid with a laptop and a head full of ideas. She had worked double shifts at the hospital while he coded through the nights, believing in him when investors scoffed, encouraging him when he doubted himself. They had lived on takeout and faith, building dreams out of love and shared struggle. Now she still worked as a pediatrician, dedicating herself to children who would never step foot in the penthouses where he now conducted business. She had chosen a path of purpose, and though she had the means to leave the underfunded city hospital behind, she stayed, convinced that real change happened on the ground, not in boardrooms. Their worlds had grown apart, slowly, then all at once. David couldn't pinpoint the exact moment he had stopped looking forward to coming home. Perhaps it had been gradual, the way their conversations had become perfunctory exchanges about schedules and practicalities, the way Venus came home exhausted from a hospital, her scrub still carrying the scent of antiseptic, while he returned from meetings where his presence alone dictated the flow of multi-million-dollar deals. They still loved each other, he supposed, but it was a quiet, tired love, one that had settled into the predictable rhythm of long-married couples who existed together rather than thrived. And then there was Tessa. She was a storm in his well-ordered life, something wild and unexpected. She had walked into the gala that night as if she owned the room, her laughter light, her presence intoxicating. She had looked at him, not as a businessman, not as a success story, but as a man. And in that fleeting moment, he had remembered what it was like to feel wanted, to be seen. The affair hadn't been immediate. It had started with stolen moments, conversations that lingered a little too long, looks that carried promises neither of them voiced. Then came the meetings outside the usual circles, the excuses to stay out later, the first touch, the first betrayal. And now, the inevitable. David had never been a man to hesitate once he made a decision. The moment he realized his heart was no longer anchored to his marriage, he had moved with the same precision that had built his empire. There was no point in prolonging the inevitable. Venus deserved honesty, and he refused to be the kind of man who lived a lie. So, on the night of their anniversary, while she waited at home with a carefully prepared dinner, he had walked in with divorce papers in hand. She hadn't cried. She hadn't screamed. She had looked at him with those same steady eyes that had once reassured him through his darkest days. And in that silence, he had felt something crack inside him. "I see," she had said after a long pause. That was all.
No begging, no acquiescence.
She had simply signed the papers and walked away, leaving him standing in the dining room where a meal had grown cold, where candlelight flickered against untouched wine glasses. Days passed in a blur. David moved into a sleek new apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows and no remnants of the life he had left behind. Tessa filled the empty spaces quickly, bringing with her the excitement of something new, something unstained by history. And yet, in the quiet moments, when the city hummed beneath him and his phone lay silent beside him, he found himself thinking of Venus. Not in longing, but in a dull ache, of something unfinished, something severed too cleanly to be real. He did not know that across the city, in a modest brownstone apartment, Venus sat in the dim light of her bedroom, staring at the ultrasound screen in quiet disbelief. She had been late, but she had blamed it on stress. The nausea had come, But she had ignored it, too preoccupied with the unraveling of her marriage to acknowledge the signs. But now, there was no denying it. The doctor's voice was gentle, but the words echoed in her mind like a distant bell. 4 distinct heartbeats. Venus's breath had caught. Not 1. Not 2. 4. She had always wanted children, but David had always said they needed to wait for the right time. Now, the irony burned. He had left, and she was carrying 4 lives within her. Sitting alone in the quiet of her bedroom, she traced a hand over her still flat stomach, feeling the weight of the future pressing down on her. The divorce papers lay unsigned on the coffee table. Next to them, a tabloid magazine featuring David and Tessa at a high-profile event. Venus closed her eyes. She had a choice to make. She could tell him. She could bring him back into her life, force a connection that was already severed. But what good would that do? Would he stay out of obligation? Would he fight for custody to preserve his public image? No. David had chosen his path, and she would choose hers. These children would not be pawns in a billionaire's divorce drama. They would not be raised in the shadow of a man who had already moved on. She would raise them alone. And so, with quiet determination, she picked up the pen, not to sign the divorce papers, but to write a new chapter. One where she and her children would stand strong, unshaken, unbroken. The early morning light crept through the half-closed blinds, casting soft shadows across the nursery walls. The room was alive with a quiet stirring of small bodies stretching beneath warm blankets, the occasional murmur of a child shifting in their sleep. Venus Hale stood in the doorway, watching the familiar scene unfold, for tiny chests rising and falling in peaceful rhythm, the delicate hum of breath filling the space with an unspoken harmony. 5 years. It felt like a lifetime and the blink of an eye all at once. She had survived the long sleepless nights, the frantic cries of hunger, the exhaustion so deep it had blurred the days into one continuous loop of feedings, diaper changes, and lullabies whispered into the darkness. She had survived the overwhelming terror of raising 4 children alone, of wondering if she could be enough, of knowing that no one was coming home at the end of the day to share the burden. And yet, she had built something beautiful. The brownstone she had bought with what little savings she had left after the divorce had transformed over the years from an empty space into a home, filled with laughter, with drawings taped to the walls, with the constant sound of little feet pattering across the wooden floors. The nursery had grown alongside its occupants, for cribs giving way to toddler beds, stuffed animals multiplying in every corner, bookshelves stacked with bedtime stories read over and over until their pages curled at the edges. Her children. Her children had become her world. Jaden, the oldest by 2 minutes, was already a natural leader, always watching over his siblings with a quiet sense of responsibility. He had his father's sharp mind and his mother's measured patience, a boy who observed before he spoke, who took his time before making decisions. Malik, the thinker, the dreamer, was forever curious about how things worked. He could spend hours with his puzzles, constructing and deconstructing the world with his small, clever hands. Diana was all energy, always moving, always searching for the next adventure. She was the one who climbed higher, ran faster, dared more than the others. It was her laughter that filled the house the loudest, her voice that carried through the halls like music. And then there was Liv, the youngest, the most intuitive. She saw things the others didn't, felt emotions before they were spoken. She would sit beside Venus in the quiet moments, her small hand reaching for hers as if sensing when her mother needed comfort. Venus loved them with a ferocity that sometimes frightened her. They had been her purpose, her salvation. They had filled the spaces left hollow by betrayal, by loneliness, by the echoes of a life she had once imagined but had long since abandoned. She had made her choice. She had chosen to raise them alone. And she had never regretted it. Outside, the city had begun to stir. The early morning traffic hummed in the distance, a reminder that the day waited beyond the safety of their home. Venus turned from the nursery and made her way to the kitchen, where the scent of freshly brewed coffee greeted her like an old friend. The routine had become second nature, Breakfast prepared in 4 different variations because no 2 children liked their eggs cooked the same way, lunches packed with meticulous care, backpacks checked for forgotten assignments. There was a rhythm to their mornings, a dance perfected through trial and error, through rushed exits and misplaced shoes, through the quiet chaos of a household where 4 young lives thrived under the same roof. By the time the children tumbled downstairs, still drowsy from sleep, she was already dressed for the day, her white coat hanging by the door, her clinic bag packed. They ate together as they always did. Jaden carefully cut his toast into precise halves, while Malik experimented by dipping his fruit into his milk. Diana wiggled impatiently in her seat, already eager to run outside, while Liv sat quietly, watching the world with those deep, knowing eyes. "Mom," Jaden said suddenly, looking up from his plate. "Why don't we have a dad?" The question came without warning, and for a brief moment, Venus felt the air still around her. She had always. The morning carried on as it always did. Breakfast was finished, dishes were washed, and backpacks were slung over small shoulders. Venus ushered them toward the door, kissing each of them on the forehead before sending them off to school with a nanny who had become like family over the years. Then she stepped into her car and drove to the clinic she had built from nothing, the place where she had poured every ounce of her dedication, where parents trusted her with the lives of their children the way she had once wished someone had been there to guide her. She had built something beautiful. A life without him. What she didn't know, what she could never have anticipated, was that on the other side of the city, in an office lined with floor-to-ceiling glass, David Hale was staring at a screen that would change everything. It had started as a normal evening. Another gala, another night of networking. The children's choir had been an afterthought, a pleasant but forgettable interlude in an event otherwise dominated by business and power. But then he had seen them. For children standing on a grand stage, their voices clear, their eyes bright. For children who looked unmistakably like him. He had felt it like a punch to the gut, the air rushing from his lungs as recognition slammed into him with brutal clarity. They were his. And in that moment, David Hale's carefully curated world, the life he had built after walking away, began to fracture beneath the weight of the past. David Hale had faced many difficult decisions in his life. He had navigated high-stakes negotiations, outmaneuvered corporate rivals, and built an empire from nothing. But nothing, not the sleepless nights, not the ruthless boardroom battles, not even the dissolution of his marriage, had prepared him for the moment he saw 4 identical faces staring back at him from the stage. The children's choir had been meant as a simple interlude, a charming touch to a prestigious gala filled with power players and philanthropists. David had hardly paid attention at first, distracted by conversations, by the ever-pressing demands of business, by the sheer routine of these events. And then his gaze had lifted. At first, it had felt like a trick of the light, then a slow, creeping certainty. His breath caught. Jaden. Malik. Diana. Liv. He didn't know their names. Not yet. But his soul recognized them before his mind could catch up. He saw himself in the shape of their eyes, the sharpness of their features, the way one of the boys furrowed his brow, the same way he did when concentrating. It was undeniable. The glass of champagne in his hand trembled. The noise of the room faded into static. He felt cold. Tessa's hand touched his arm, her voice a distant murmur of concern, but he barely registered it. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the stage. From the children who shouldn't exist. From the children he hadn't known existed. His mind reeled. Venue. She had never told him. The realization hit like a physical blow. He had walked away believing their chapter was closed, believing she would move on just as he had. And all this time, she had been raising his children. 4 of them. The applause brought him back to reality, but only barely. As the children filed off stage, he rose abruptly, ignoring Tessa's questioning gaze, ignoring the expectant glances from those around him. He needed answers. He needed to see her. Venus had expected many things from her evening at the gala. She had expected polite conversation with benefactors, the usual pleasantries exchanged over drinks and carefully prepared speeches. She had expected to beam with pride as her children performed, watching them take the stage with the same fearless determination they brought to every challenge. She had not expected to see David Hale standing in the crowd. His expression was thunderous, his presence sending a ripple through the fabric of her carefully built world. She had not expected the past to come crashing back into the present with such force. She saw him move toward her before he even spoke, the sheer intensity in his gaze making her breath catch. He looked different than the last time she had seen him, older, sharper, the weight of years settled into his features. And yet the raw energy of the man she had once loved still radiated from him, a force of nature that had not dimmed with time. Venu. His voice was controlled, but she could hear the undercurrent of something dangerous beneath it. She lifted her chin, refusing to be intimidated. David. He exhaled sharply, eyes scanning her face as if searching for confirmation of what he already knew. His jaw tightened. They're mine. A statement, not a question. Venus's fingers curled around the stem of her wine glass, steadying herself against the inevitable storm. Yes. The silence between them was heavy, electric. His hands clenched at his sides. Why didn't you tell me? A dozen answers flashed through her mind, each one as valid as the next. Because you had already left. Because you had chosen a different life. Because I was never going to beg you to stay. But in the end, she said only, you made your choice, David. I made mine. He let out a harsh breath, running a hand through his hair. Damn it, Venus. That wasn't your choice to make alone. She arched a brow. Wasn't it? A muscle ticked in his jaw, frustration evident in every line of his body. You had no right to keep them from me. Anger flared in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. And you had no right to walk away so easily. His breath hitched, and for the first time that night, she saw something flicker in his expression. Something raw. Something vulnerable. She sighed, the fight draining out of her. David, I didn't do this out of spite. I did what I thought was best for them. His gaze softened just enough to let something else slip through. And what about what was best for me? Venus studied him for a long moment before answering. You seem to be doing just fine without us. David flinched, and she knew she had struck a nerve. For 5 years, he had believed he had left behind a marriage, a partnership, a chapter of his life that no longer fit. He had walked away with clean hands, thinking they had both moved forward. And now, standing here, he was realizing that he had not just left a wife. He had left a family he never even knew he had. She saw the war waging behind his eyes, the conflict of a man who had always been in control, now grappling with something far greater than himself. You want to be part of their lives now? She asked, not unkindly. His response was immediate. Yes.
Venu est trop tightened.
It's not that simple, David. His eyes darkened. It is to me. She shook her head. They don't know you. You can't just walk in and expect them to. I don't expect anything, he interrupted. I just need a chance. The quiet desperation in his voice made her chest ache. She closed her eyes briefly, the weight of 5 years pressing down on her shoulders. She had built this life alone, had fought for stability, for normalcy, for a world where her children never had to feel abandoned. And now, the man who had left them behind was standing before her, asking for a place in it. Slowly, she nodded. We'll start slow, she said, her voice firm but not unkind. They'll meet you as a friend first, someone from my past. David swallowed, nodding. No big gestures. No sudden claims. They're old enough to have feelings about this, and I won't let them get hurt. I understand. His voice was hoarse. Venus studied him one last time before sighing. Then we'll see where it goes from there. For the first time that night, David looked like a man who had finally grasped just how much he had lost. And for the first time in 5 years, Venus felt the ground beneath her shift, the future suddenly uncertain in a way she had never anticipated. Because no matter how much she had convinced herself otherwise, this was no longer just her story. It had never been just hers. The first meeting was arranged with meticulous care. Venus had insisted on a neutral place, somewhere familiar to the children but unfamiliar to David. A space that wouldn't tip the balance of control in his favor. She chose the park near their home, the one with a sprawling playground and shaded benches where she had spent countless afternoons watching them grow. David arrived early. He had never been the kind of man who liked waiting, but today was different. Today he was stepping into unknown territory, into a world that had existed without him, a world he had unknowingly abandoned. He had thought about this moment for days, about what he would say, about how they would look at him, about whether they would see a stranger or something more. The weight of it felt endless. Then, at last, he saw them. Venus approached first, walking with a natural grace he had once taken for granted. She was dressed simply, her white coat replaced by jeans and a light sweater, her hair tied back. Yet, she was still the most composed person in the park. Behind her, 4 small figures trailed in a loose formation, their movements betraying a mixture of curiosity and hesitation. David's throat tightened. Jaden, the tallest, walked slightly ahead of the others, his gaze cautious, assessing. There was something in the way he carried himself that reminded David of his younger self, the same quiet watchfulness, the same measured steps. Malik was beside him, his eyes darting around, taking in every detail as if cataloging the moment for later analysis. Diana was the most energetic, skipping ahead briefly before stopping abruptly, as if suddenly remembering she was supposed to be wary. And then there was Liv, trailing just behind Venus, her small hand curled around her mother's fingers, her expression unreadable. David forced himself to breathe. Venus stopped a few steps away and glanced down at the children. "This is my friend, David," she said, her voice even. "He used to be someone important to me a long time ago." Jaden's eyes narrowed slightly, but he said nothing. David crouched to their level, instinctively trying to appear less intimidating. "Hey." His voice was steady despite the storm inside him. They stared at him. Silence stretched between them, thick and expectant. Diana was the first to break it. "Do you like swings?" she asked suddenly. David blinked.
Yeah, I guess I do."
Her head tilted. "When was the last time you were on one?" David hesitated. It had been years, decades maybe. His childhood had been a blur of struggle, of moving forward, always forward, with no time for childish things. "A long time ago," he admitted. Diana considered this. "You should try it again." Before he could respond, she took off toward the playground. Malik followed, still watching him as if trying to decipher a puzzle. Venus gave him a small nod. "Go ahead," she murmured. David hesitated only a second before following. The next hour passed in a strange haze of half-formed connections and tentative interactions. He pushed Diana on the swings, helped Malik build a castle in the sandbox, and answered Jaden's quiet but pointed questions, about where he was from, what he did, why he was there. Liv was the hardest to reach. She stayed close to Venus, watching him carefully, as if waiting for something, perhaps waiting to see if he would disappear as easily as he had arrived. He wanted to tell them everything. He wanted to explain why he had left, why he had never known about them, why he was here now. But words felt insufficient, too fragile to bridge the gap of 5 lost years. Instead, he listened. He listened to Diana's endless chatter about her school friends, to Malik's detailed explanation of how he planned to build a robot that could do his homework, to Jaden's cautious but undeniable curiosity about the world outside their own. And most importantly, he listened to what they did not say. They did not ask why he was there. They did not ask who he really was. They did not ask why he had been gone. Because to them, he was not yet a father. He was only a visitor in their world. The meetings continued over the following weeks. Venus kept firm boundaries. No sudden appearances, no overwhelming gestures. He was allowed to see them in carefully structured environments, in places where they felt comfortable, in spaces where they could dictate the terms of their interaction. David understood why. He had no right to demand anything more. And yet, the more time he spent with them, the more he felt the ache of what he had missed. He saw it in the way Jaden instinctively looked after his siblings. The way Malik absorbed the world like a scientist in constant discovery. The way Diana lit up every room she entered. The way Liv stayed close to Venus, her presence a silent anchor. They were incredible. They were smart and kind and endlessly fascinating. And they had become all of those things without him. He had missed their first steps, their first words, their first everything. He had not been there for the scraped knees, the bedtime stories, the whispered fears in the middle of the night. The realization was a sharp, unbearable thing. One evening, after another slow but steady visit, David found himself alone in his apartment, staring at a single photograph. It was a grainy image taken quickly on his phone when they weren't looking, just a snapshot of them running through the park, their laughter frozen in time. For the first time in years, he felt something deeper than ambition, deeper than regret. He felt the weight of fatherhood pressing down on him, heavy and undeniable. He wanted more. But he knew that trust, once broken, was not easily mended. And for the first time in his life, David Hale was willing to wait. The sun cast long golden streaks across the park, filtering through the branches of the tall oaks as children's laughter echoed in the distance. Venus sat on a wooden bench, watching her children chase each other across the grass, their small bodies moving with the reckless energy only youth could sustain. She had long since learned to anticipate their every movement, to recognize the moment before Diana would tumble or Malik would hesitate before climbing too high. David sat beside her, silent for a long time. He had been coming to the park with them for months now, slowly integrating into their world. But always as a visitor. Never fully inside. Never fully accepted. "They're remarkable," he said finally, his voice quiet.
Venu no dead.
"They are." He exhaled, rubbing his hands together, watching as Jaden helped Liv with a stack of building blocks in the sandpit. "I don't know how to do this." She turned her head slightly, studying him. The confident, immovable David Hale she had once known had been stripped away. In his place was a man struggling to find his footing, a man trying to bridge a chasm of 5 years. "You don't have to know everything," she said. "You just have to keep showing up." David let out a short laugh, though there was no humor in it. "That's not how my world works. In business, you don't get second chances. You don't get to fail and keep going." Venus tilted her head. "This isn't business, David. This is family. And in family, failing isn't the end. It's part of the process." He didn't answer right away. His gaze was fixed on Jaden, the boy who watched him the most carefully, who measured his every move. Jaden had taken the longest to warm up to him, who still hesitated before fully letting him in. "How long do you think it will take for them to see me as more than just some stranger in their lives?" Venus followed his gaze, watching as Jaden carefully adjusted the wooden block in front of Liv before nodding in satisfaction. "As long as it takes," she said simply. The words should have been frustrating. David had spent his life chasing results, expecting outcomes, measuring his success by numbers and growth charts. But this was different. He could not buy their love. He could not demand their trust. He could only earn it, piece by piece, in small moments like these. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They simply sat there, two people who had once been bound together by love and dreams, now connected by something deeper. By responsibility. By shared history. By 4 young lives who were watching. Waiting. Mom. Dad. The words came so suddenly, so unexpectedly, that David nearly missed them. He turned, his heart jolting in his chest. Diana was waving at them from the top of the climbing structure, grinning proudly, completely unaware of the earthquake she had just caused. David felt the ground shift beneath him. Venus stilled beside him. He knew she had noticed it too, that slip of the tongue. That word. Diana had never used it before. Not in reference to him. Dad. He swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. Did she just? Yes, Venus murmured, her voice unreadable. Diana, oblivious, had already turned back to her game, calling for her brothers to follow her. David inhaled sharply, gripping the edge of the bench as if steadying himself against an invisible force. It was a simple word. A single syllable. But it meant everything. The weeks passed, and something shifted. Jaden no longer kept his distance. He started asking questions, not the guarded ones of their early interactions, but real, curious inquiries about David's work, about his past, about what he had been like as a child. Malik, forever the engineer, had begun to bring David his latest creations, eager for feedback. Diana had already claimed him as her own, throwing herself at him with fearless enthusiasm whenever he arrived. And Liv, the quiet observer, the one who had always been the hardest to reach. She had started sitting beside him during their outings, leaning her small frame against him without words, without hesitation. David felt it with every fiber of his being. The walls crumbling, the pieces coming together. But trust was not a one-time achievement. It was a fragile, ever-growing thing. And he knew that every step forward could be undone with one misstep. So he learned to listen. He learned to wait. And when the time came, he learned to ask. One afternoon, as Venus walked with him toward the parking lot after another visit, David finally voiced the thought that had been weighing on him for weeks. I want more time with them. Venus stopped walking. She turned to face him, arms folded. More time how? I don't know, he admitted. More time outside of these planned meetings. Something normal. Something, he exhaled. Something real. Venus studied him for a long moment. Real, she repeated. Yes. A pause. Then she nodded slowly. Okay. David's eyebrows lifted in surprise. Okay. She smirked. You were expecting a fight? Honestly? Yes. Venus sighed, running a hand through her hair. I was always going to let them have a relationship with you, David. But I had to be sure. I had to see that you were serious. That you weren't just here because of guilt or obligation. His jaw tightened. I'm here because I want to be. I know, she said, softer now. That's why I'm saying yes. Relief coursed through him. He hadn't even realized how much he had feared her answer until now. So what does this mean? He asked. It means we figure it out together, she said. Maybe you take them for a weekend here and there. Maybe you join us for school events. We start small, and we adjust as we go. David nodded. It wasn't everything. But it was a beginning. Venus turned to leave, then hesitated. David. He glanced at her. They're happy, she said quietly. I know you weren't here at the start. But you're here now. And if you keep showing up, if you keep proving that you're not going anywhere, they'll believe in you. David swallowed past the lump in his throat. Thank you, he said. And for once, the words felt inadequate. Venus just nodded. As he watched her walk away, David allowed himself to breathe. This wasn't the life he had imagined. It wasn't the one he had built. Or the one he had abandoned. But maybe, just maybe, it was the one he was meant to have. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. Hit the bell icon so you never miss a new video. If you enjoyed this, check out our other videos. There's plenty more to explore.